So I'm really happy that we have an expert here, Michelle Norris, professor in social policy, director of the Geary Institute for Research in Public Policy, an expert in housing policies, urban regeneration. She's around for many years. She does not only do research, produce many articles, support many students in their PhD and masters, but she has impact. She won 2 impact awards in Ireland from the University College in Dublin, as well as from the Irish Research Council. She is someone who's not only asking questions, but also answering and putting them into practice. So I'm really happy, Michelle Norris, that you are here to tell us about social housing. So the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I now feel under a lot of pressure to talk about impact, but which I won't do, by the way. So, good morning, everybody. I'm really pleased to be here this morning to talk to you about resilience and fragility in social housing systems. And I actually have a subtitle for my presentation, which is the micro-political economy of social renting in Western Europe. So I'll talk a little bit about what I mean by these terms later in the presentation, and things like what is micro-political economy. But I just wanted to start by mentioning that the focus of my presentation is on social rented housing, so social housing that is rented. So I understand, and I know in your project you've talked about lots of different forms of social housing. And in lots of countries, social housing isn't rented, and there's various forms of social ownership housing, etc., particularly in southern European countries. But my focus is on social rented housing. So when I say social rented housing in Western Europe, it's probably more correct to say northwestern Europe, since Spain is also Western Europe. So the ideas in my presentation draw on a book which I've been threatening to finish for about 3 years now, but still haven't finished, and also a Horizon Europe project which I'm coordinating, which started earlier in the year, called Equal House, from Housing Inequality to Sustainable, Inclusive and Affordable Housing Solutions. So there's a lot of things in common between my project and Redwell, so I was really interested in hearing about your research and all the really fascinating issues you've discussed during the project. So I just want to introduce the area and the topic of my presentation by talking about the literature on social rented housing and the narratives, our themes which dominate the literature. So the literature in recent decades on social housing is strongly focused on the decline that's identified in many social housing sectors after the period of very strong growth in the availability of social housing we saw in many Western European countries in the decades that followed World War II. So the what's called the golden age of social housing. And if you look at the literature, it emphasizes that social housing has reduced as a proportion of households accommodated, so it's declined in that way in many countries. It's what social scientists call residualized, so it's as well as reducing, it's increasingly concentrated on housing the lowest income households and also households who are socially excluded in other ways, formerly homeless households, for instance. There's also a huge emphasis on the retrenchment of public investment in social housing, and on the fact that public capital spending on social housing provision has declined dramatically since the 1980s in the vast majority of European countries as a proportion of total spending, generally by between 50% and 2/3. And it's been partially replaced by individual person subsidies, housing allowances for individual households, but that hasn't in any way fully counterbalanced the scale of the decline in public spending. So, on the basis of these trends in the housing literature, many people here will be aware housing is commonly called the wobbly pillar under the welfare state, because so many scholars think that housing and housing policies play a much more modest role in welfare states and also are much more prone to retrenchment and cuts than other welfare services like or social security benefits. So, as well as this literature on the decline of social housing, there's also an enormous literature on the drivers of these trends. And some authors focus on the fundamental characteristics of housing as a area of public investment, a part of the welfare state, and as a good, and argue that these characteristics make it much more prone to cuts and retrenchment than other welfare services. Michael Harlow's book, The People's Home, which was I reread recently, and it reminded me that this was the book that first inspired my interest in housing. I read it as a master's student, and it's just as wonderful to read, I won't say how many years later. So Harlow argues that housing's asset value means that it's very prone to retrenchment, and government involvement and intervention in housing markets are particularly likely to be weak. And that's because private property rights are central to the operation of market economies. So proposals that threaten those rights, like proposals to decommodify the supply of housing, are much more contested than proposals that threaten to decommodify education services, for instance, or health services. He also argues that housing has a functional value for governments in resolving great socioeconomic crisis, like the crisis we saw in the decades after World War II. And on occasions, governments will intervene very strongly in housing markets where that's of strategic importance for what he calls the maintenance and development of capitalist social and economic systems. But outside those periods of extreme crisis, governments don't enter, they tend to retrench. And then other writers on welfare states, like Paul Pearson, for instance, in his classic book on dismantling the welfare state, argues that the way in which housing services have to be funded and provided make them particularly prone to cutbacks and particularly unstable. So he points out that providing housing requires a big lumpy investment, a big injection of finance at the start to provide to build or buy the houses. The service is then consumed over the long term, often at sub-market rents in the case of social housing, and that makes it uniquely vulnerable to retrenchment. So governments often look at this big lump of injection of money and think, we could cut that back. And also, if a government does cut spending on housing, often because housing is slow to provide, often that government doesn't suffer the consequences. It's the next government or even subsequent generations have to put up with the lack of affordable housing. So there's some of the kind of basic arguments in the literature, but in terms of the fundamental drivers of housing's weakness. But there is also a huge literature on the more, what I call, proximate drivers of housing's weak role in welfare states. So in other words, the immediate drivers. And this literature emphasises broadly that it's broad political economy developments that have led to social housing's reduction. So they emphasise, for instance, social housing was vital to addressing the post-war socioeconomic challenges faced by many European countries. That's no longer the case. The British author Peter Malpass links that to what he calls the modernisation of housing markets from the 1970s as mortgage markets grew and developed. And the private sector grew in importance, so social housing wasn't as important. Others emphasised the declining electoral power of the working class, social democracy, the rise of neoliberalism, and the associated phenomenon of financialisation. And then it's also important to emphasise that in some cases the failure of social housing providers to provide good quality dwellings, the concentration of poor quality high-rise and system-built dwellings in the social housing sector has what some authors call delegitimised the sector, and that's contributed to its decline. So this narrative about the decline of social housing is very strongly influenced by developments in Anglophone, English-speaking countries, in other words, and also in the ex-communist countries of Europe. So this table looks at the size of the social rented sector in most European countries. I've left out countries that have no social housing or for which I couldn't find the data because I had to compile this from a lot of sources. So it looks at the proportion of households in these countries living in social housing. And you can see at the bottom of the table in the UK, the size of the social rented sector declined from 25% of households in 1990 to 6.7% in recent years. And also in the ex-communist countries of Central and Eastern Europe, such as Czechia, Hungary, Latvia, Poland, Slovakia and Slovenia, we've seen a huge decline in their, what was a state-owned rented housing sector, which wasn't exactly identical to social housing. There were some significant differences, but it was largely similar in the sense that it was a decommodified non-market sector, and they have shrunk radically because the sector has been entirely privatised or largely privatised in recent years. So that's the dominant narrative in the literature. It's a narrative of the decline of the social housing sector, strongly focused on its shrinkage and residualisation. And it's also a narrative that focuses very heavily on the role which the political economy, broadly defined, has played in shaping this decline. So in this paper, I adopt a different approach. So rather than focusing solely on the fragility of social housing systems, I focus on the significant vestiges of resilience that have persisted within the sector in recent decades. And you can see from the picture of the slide is a particularly famous example of this resilience. It's Karl Marxhof in Vienna. It's built during the so-called Red Vienna period, during the wars in Vienna. It's probably, I think it's fair to say, the most famous example of social housing development in the world. And because Vienna City Council fund this touring exhibition of the Vienna model of social housing, it's probably Vienna, I think it's fair to say, the most famous example of resilient social housing in the world. So in terms of focusing on these examples of resilience, I also tried to clarify why the tenures proved resilient in some countries and fragile in others. So another difference from the kind of dominant narrative in the literature is, rather than focusing on the role which macro political economy factors that are external to the social housing system play in shaping the resilience and fragility, I focus instead on the influence of political and economic factors that are primarily internal to social housing systems. So one of the arguments I make is that social housing sectors have their own internal economy, which is shaped by how they're financed, how land is procured for house building, and they also have their own internal politics shaped by the socioeconomic characteristics of tenant populations. And the characteristics of the organisations that provide social housing. So I call this a micro political economy, or I suppose another word for it would be kind of an ecosystem, if you will. Now, of course, it's important to acknowledge that often the boundaries between factors that are external to the social housing system and are internal is difficult to draw, it's blurred. So, for instance, public capital spending on social housing is ultimately shaped by government decisions. But within the sector, the type of public spending and the nature of public spending and the amount and cost of public spending and how it revolves within the social housing system does influence the sector. So to some extent, these macro and micro factors, the differences are blurred. But I still think the focus on the internal dynamics of social housing sectors is valuable, and also potentially plots a course for policies and interventions and suggestions for reform to strengthen the social housing sector from within, if you like. So I just want to move on now and just discuss briefly the kind of concepts underpinning the paper, and also some of the cases I'm going to examine, because I don't plan to examine every country in Western Europe. So I mentioned the paper is entitled Resilience and Fragility in Social Housing Systems, and I'm sure many of you are aware that this, particularly the concept of resilience, is used to mean a whole pile of different things in different social science literatures. But in this paper, I use these concepts of resilience and fragility in quite a specific and rather narrow way to refer to, firstly, the tendency of social housing sectors to expand in resilient cases or contract in fragile cases over the long run. In terms of the proportion of all households accommodated, and the ability or inability of the sectors to continue to expand or at least retain the share of households accommodated in the context of challenges related to the wider political economy. So examples of the challenges that might arise that affect social housing systems, the wider challenges would be economic crisis, fiscal crises, banking crises, or growing ideological or political opposition. So the ability to withstand these adverse challenges in the wider political economy process is a key characteristic of resilient systems, and fragile systems don't share this characteristic. And in terms of the kind of elements of the micro political economy, I plan to focus on four, which are finance for housing, the procurement of land for social housing, which is obviously vital. We can't build any houses without land. The characteristics of tenants, the socioeconomic and ethnic characteristics of tenants, and also the characteristics of organisations that provide social housing. But just for reasons of time, even though all these factors are significant in shaping the long-term trajectories of social housing, and I make the argument in lots of ways they're mutually reinforcing. But for reasons of time, I don't focus equally on all of them. I do discuss all of them, but I focus primarily on the first two factors, which are finance and land. And in the paper, I plan to just focus on 6, as I mentioned, northwestern European countries, which you can see in this graph. So I should mention, first of all, I focus on England. So rather than focus on the UK more broadly, I know there's some British colleagues here, and you'll know that since devolution of government in the UK, when Tony Blair was in power, the policies of the different countries within Britain and the province of Northern Ireland have diverged quite substantially from each other, the housing policies. So I just focus on England in my comments here. I also focus on, or examine Austria, England, Denmark, France, Ireland and the Netherlands. And among the cases examined, Austria I define as a resilient case, because you can see from the graph 16% of households in Austria lived in social housing in 1980, 23.6% in 2020. So in that sector, in that country, the sector is growing quite substantially. Similarly, in Denmark, 14% of households lived in social housing in 1980. It's now 21.4% in 2020. And in France, the sector has also grown not as substantially, from 15% of households in 1980 to 8.7% in 2020. So they're my 3 resilient cases. My 3 fragile cases, you can see England is in the red line on the graph, so that's quite an extreme example of a fragile case. The social rented sector has declined from housing 31.7% of households in 1980 to 16.7% in 2020. In Ireland, the sector housed 12% of households in 1980 and 12% in 2020, so it's remained static, but the fall over the long term is much more substantial than that. It housed about 20% of households in the late 1960s, and you can see this decline continued for a lot of the period between 1980 and 2020. The growth of the sector is now relatively new. And even though the Dutch have the biggest social housing sector in the world, to my knowledge, I'm open to correction on that one, I also include the Netherlands as a fragile case, because the sector there has shrunk from a peak in 1990 of 38% of households down to 34.4% in 2020. Although Maria told me over breakfast that that's now being reversed. But anyway, it's hard to keep up. Okay, so they're introductory comments. I now want to just move on and look at these micro-political economy factors in more depth and look at how they've shaped these different patterns of resilience and fragility in these different countries. So the first issue I want to look at is finance. And as I mentioned, social housing is unusual in terms of welfare services in that it requires big, lumpy, upfront capital spending before the service can be provided. And this finance is challenging to raise and challenging to service, because social housing dwellings are generally let at sub-market rents in some countries at rents that are only a tiny fraction of market rents. So the sources, form, cause and cost of this finance are key determinants of the tenure's resilience or fragility. So in the case study countries, the details of how the social housing sector is financed vary quite substantially. Obviously, there's two aspects of financing housing. There's revenue, subsidies, ongoing subsidies or payments, usually from rents, sometimes from housing allowances. And then there's the money for the capital for buying or building dwellings, for buying and servicing land. So in this table, I just look at the sources of capital for social housing output in the case study countries. And as you can see, and I should mention, the table focuses on the sources used to finance the main source of social housing in the case study countries. So in Ireland, that's local authority or municipal housing. In Austria, it's limited profit housing, association housing. In England, it's housing association housing. So I don't look at every single source. I look at the primary providers. So the table highlights very significant variety in how the social housing sector is financed in these different countries. So it's a bit complex and difficult to follow. So I'm just going to call out the kind of key points that are relevant to the analysis presented here. So the first point is that in almost every country, loans provide the main source of finance for housing, and they provide the vast majority of the capital finance for housing. The only exception to this is Ireland, where central government grants, so not loans, they don't have to be repaid, central government grants provide between 70 and 100% of the funding for social housing provision. The rest comes from local government equity, but actually in recent years, the vast equity from selling, privatising social housing, actually. But in recent years, the vast majority of capitals come from central government. So it's almost 100% from central government grant. In all other countries, it's loans. And that's just for a very simple reason, that loans have inherent benefits by spreading out these lumpy costs of capital over the long term for social housing provision. So just like for individuals, it's cheaper to get a mortgage than to save up the costs of providing housing upfront. The same goes for social housing providers. So you'll see from the table the sources of these loan finances vary. There's some government loans in the system, from central government, local government, regional government, the Länder in Austria. But in most cases, the vast majority of funding comes from the market in some sources. So from commercial banks, not public banks, from capital markets, from things like bond issues, or in the case of Denmark, from mortgage banks that are funded by bond issues on the stock market. France is unusual in that it has a national savings scheme called the Caisse de dépôt et consignation, in my terrible school French. Apologies to any French people here. So it's a very interesting scheme that draws on the proceeds of government subsidised saving schemes in banks, pools them centrally and lends them out for housing. You'll also notice that you'll also notice that in most countries, social landlords contribute equity finance to the cost of housing provisions. That's in the form of cash injections, but more often in the form of land that they own and have serviced for that they can put towards the cost of housing provision. So that's the case in Denmark, France, Austria. And notably in Denmark and Austria, tenants also contribute equity to the costs of housing provision in the form of security deposits or down payments, if you like. And in Austria, these are very substantial. They're up to 10% of the costs of social housing delivery. So in the likes of Vienna, that's very substantial cash contribution. So what are the implications of all these different financing systems for the resilience and fragility of social housing systems? So even though I didn't cover revenue finance for housing and rents in the table, I just want to return to that issue briefly and make the point that the adequacy of revenue finance is a very significant issue in terms of the resilience of the system. So uniquely among the 6 cases, in Ireland, rents for social housing are linked to tenants' incomes. So they're linked progressively to income. The higher your income, the higher your rent. The lower your income, the lower your rent. And because the sector in Ireland is now very residualised and very targeted at low-income households, the rental income is very low. It's not enough to contribute to the costs of servicing debt. In my view, it's not enough to contribute to the costs of maintaining dwellings, which are very poorly maintained as a result. So that's one of the reasons why the sector can't be financed using loans and is totally dependent on government grants, which are all on balance sheet. In other words, part of government debt, and they're very, very prone to retrenchment during recessions. So during the global financial crisis, we saw government funding for social housing cut by 82%, and output fell by 82% as well, because it's the main source of funding, and it's contributed to a very severe homelessness crisis in Ireland currently. By contrast, in other countries, rents by law must cover costs minus government subsidies. And in Austria, rents have not just to cover costs, but to generate a small surplus that the housing associations then are required to reinvest in equity, mainly in land. They've similar arrangements that rents must cover costs in Denmark and France. In the UK and in the Netherlands, rents take account of other issues like local incomes, dwelling standards, but they're still broadly over the long term generally generation of income to cover costs. So the scale of revenue finance is a major determinant of the resilience and fragility of the sector, but also the reliability of this revenue finance is a significant determinant of the resilience of the sector. And that's due to the very long-term nature of the loans that are the primary source of finance for social housing. So they're generally between 20 and 40 years, but it's not unknown to have 60-year term loans within the social housing sector. So obviously you need a reliable stream of revenue over that period to enable you to service the debt. And in England, for instance, housing associations were forced by government to cut rents by 1% per annum for the 4 years from 2016. And this undermined the sector's creditworthiness among banks and capital market lenders, and therefore its ability to borrow for long terms and at low interest rates, and also led to was one of the factors that led to the redesignation of all their debt back on balance sheet as part of government debt, and the government was ultimately forced to withdraw that arrangement. But it's still a good example of the challenges caused by this insecure income. Also, the reliability of this revenue income over the long term enables social housing landlords to accumulate surpluses, particularly after the social housing development loans are paid back, and then reinvest these surpluses to fund equity contributions to new social housing. So in almost all resilient social housing sectors, this rental income is revolved. So they're all revolving funds at some scale. And this is very important for the long-term resilience of the sector, because it makes the sector more financially viable. There's less reliance on debt, but it also makes the sector more politically viable, because there's less reliance on government, particularly in government funding, particularly in the cases where there's an ideologically unsympathetic government. The social housing sector is not as reliant on their funding and doesn't have to compete with other welfare services for funding. So revenue income, cost and long-term reliability is a really critical factor that shapes the resilience of social housing systems. So just to return then to the table I presented and talk about the arrangements for providing capital finance to social housing systems. There's a number of characteristics of these arrangements that influence the resilience and fragility of social housing systems. So in this graphic, I've highlighted three, and these factors are interlinked and overlap, but I felt they were worth calling out as separate issues. So the first issue is a characteristic of capital financing arrangements that influences the resilience and fragility of social housing systems is the breadth of these arrangements. So in other words, the number and variety of sources used to fund the social housing sector and the relationship between them. So in the case study countries, they vary from a single source in Ireland, government grants. I mentioned rents make it only a tiny contribution in Ireland. Whereas English and Dutch housing associations draw on broadly three sources of finance, including rents, and their counterparts in Austria, Denmark and France draw on at least five. So the circuits of finance, so to speak, are narrower in countries with fragile social housing sectors and broader in countries with resilient social housing sectors. In terms of more sources of finance. So one obvious explanation for this is that by combining multiple sources of finance, so finance from tenants, finance from government, finance from markets, finance from non-profit sources like savings schemes, it's much more likely to result in greater funding availability for social housing sectors, and vice versa. Narrow sources of finance are likely to result in less availability. And the extreme example of this I mentioned is Ireland, where the sector is entirely funded by government. And even though we haven't experienced the ideological backlash against social housing in Ireland seen in many other European countries, for practical reasons, in a financial crisis, the government always cuts capital spending first, because it's easier than cutting the wages of nurses and teachers and university lecturers. So we've seen a kind of a boom-bust model of public finance being available to housing in Ireland over the decades. A very big bust after the global financial crisis. And that's in large part linked to the reliance just on government finance. So the second characteristic of capital finance arrangements that influence the resilience and fragility of social housing systems is the stability of these arrangements. So stability over the long term in terms of the volume of finance available, and also in terms of the cost of finance available. And the fragile countries I've highlighted are associated with less funding stability over time. And it's much more in terms of much more variable over time, like in Ireland, or long-term decline, as we've seen in England. And the combination of different sources of finance influences this stability, because, as I mentioned, it's much more likely that you'll be able to source finance on a very long-term basis from a combination of sources. And stability in financing cost as well as volume of finance is also very significant in underpinning the resilience of the sector, because unlike private landlords in most countries, social landlords can't increase rents if costs increase very easily. So resilient sectors have strong measures in place to ensure stable financing costs. So in the countries examined in my paper, Denmark, for instance, has national interest rate subsidies that subsidise the loans from private mortgage banks to ensure the interest rate remains stable. In Austria, there are fixed rate loans from the Länder, from regional government. And in both Austria, Denmark and France, there's very strong regulation of non-government sources of finance to reduce the profit made and ensure stability. So in contrast, social landlords in England source most finance from commercial banks and capital markets that aren't as regulated as the banking sources we see in Austria and Denmark. So they're more directly exposed to fluctuating financial market interest rates and fees and pricing risks. So then the final kind of characteristic of capital financing arrangements that influences the resilience and fragility of social housing systems is their permeability. In other words, the extent to which investment in social housing is retained in the sector and recycled within the social housing sector, or the extent to which it seeps out in the value of rents, assets, equity, and surpluses that are captured by external actors like private investments. Where the systems are not permeable, where they're sealed and the rental income can be retained and recycled and used to fund equity contributions over the long term, these are generally much stronger systems. Conversely, if the money leaks out of the system to private investors, tenants, whatever, obviously then that requires more government finance or more other types of finance to provide more social housing or keep output up. So the most obvious way in which finance leaks out of the system is via privatisation. That's been particularly extensive in Ireland and England, and notably dwellings have been sold at a big discount from market value to tenants. So the market value is normally the replacement value. So that is means that as one government sells off the housing, the next generation has to reinvest in providing new housing. So it's particularly negative for the resilience of the sector. In the Netherlands, we also see privatisation, but generally sales are at market value, so it's not such a significant negative impact. But we have seen in recent years the government impose a so-called social landlords tax in an effort to extract subsidies from the sector. So that's also undermined resilience. So I want to move on and briefly discuss the impact which tenants, and particularly the socio-economic and ethnic profile of tenants, has on the resilience and fragility of social housing systems in terms of both their financial and their political resilience. So generally, if social housing is strongly focused on very, very low income tenants, the ability of the tenant body to pay rents that reflect the cost of providing housing is obviously much more limited, and they either require a significant subsidy from government or rents that don't reflect costs, reflect incomes, for instance, as in Ireland. So that would be expected to constrain new output and thereby reduce the size of the social housing sector. Whereas in sectors that are larger and more inclusive in terms of including people from a range of income deciles, tenants can generally afford to make a larger contribution to funding housing costs. But the significance of this issue of targeting and residualisation of the social housing sector for its resilience and fragility isn't only a financial one, it's also political, because in the case study countries, larger social housing sectors are less likely to be marginalised from mainstream political concerns. So Peter Malpass's classic history of social housing's role in the British welfare state, for instance, argues that as the sector has shrunk and residualised, it's become more marginalised from political concerns. Other authors have emphasised that as ethnic minority populations have become increasingly concentrated in social housing in European countries, that has further reinforced the marginalisation of the sector from mainstream political concerns. Conversely, even though right across these 6 countries I examine, there are examples of tenants mounting campaigns and other activists to protect the social housing sector from privatisation, from cuts in government subsidies. Generally, higher income tenants are more likely to have the resources and political influence to campaign successfully to protect their tenure. And we see that example particularly in Denmark, where the sector is still large and it contains quite a wide variety of income groups, where tenants have played a central role in protecting the social housing sector from politicians' efforts to privatise. So the third issue I want to examine that influences, micro-political economy issue that influences the resilience and fragility of the social housing sector then is land. And land is generally neglected in the social housing literature because people who study land are often different from people who study housing. But in my view, it's one of the most significant factors that influences the tenure's resilience and fragility, because it's usually a very large component of the costs of housing delivery, particularly in view of the fact that the need for social housing is generally concentrated in unaffordable areas, which tend to be cities, and large urban areas, which tend to be areas where land markets are very hot. So if social housing landlords have access to cheap land, this is an enormously valuable, invisible type subsidy for social housing delivery. So in the 6 countries I examine in the paper, they have employed a variety of mechanisms for providing land for social housing over the years since World War II, since the sector started to grow. And in some countries, the mechanisms used have changed over time. So this graphic summarises the kind of main approaches, and it organises them into the most decommodifying approaches, the approaches that completely decommodify land markets or replace the market with a state-controlled system of land provision at one end, to other mechanisms that are entirely reliant on the market at the other end. So at the most kind of decommodified end, we see things like compulsory purchase, generally local government having the right to compulsorily purchase land for social housing. Often at existing use value. In other words, if the land is being used for agricultural purposes, if there's sheep in the field, as we often have in Ireland, they pay agricultural use prices. A similar idea is the idea of preemption, where the government or a social landlord has kind of first refusal if a landowner is selling land. And they can buy, as I said, sometimes at existing use value, not in every case. So that's the kind of most radical, if you like, option. Then in other cases, we see examples where government attempts to actively manage the supply of land for social housing and sometimes for other types of housing by purchasing raw or undeveloped land at market value, sometimes at existing use value, then securing planning permission, servicing the land for residential development and using it for social housing. So by buying ahead, it buys cheaper and manages the availability of land very actively. Then at the kind of more marketised end, we see mechanisms like what's called inclusionary zoning that emerged in the United States and then moved to Europe in the 1980s and 1990s. And that requires private developers to include some land sites, service sites or dwellings for social housing in private developments. In some countries, this is just provided at market prices. In some countries, it's sub-market prices. In some countries, it's at cost or in fact below cost. But generally, it's much more market dependent than the other models. And then at the kind of less interventionist end, we see governments that subsidise land markets by just purchasing land for social housing at market value, and sometimes not just at its existing market value, but including its so-called hope value. So the price landowners aspire to getting if the land gets planning permission. So that in that case, the government is just essentially subsidising land markets to get or social landlords to get access to land for social housing. So I mentioned these are the kind of broad approaches to providing land for social housing that's existed in the case study countries since World War II. So in those countries, the dominant approaches has changed over time. And it's quite striking that in several of the fragile countries, so England and the Netherlands, the approach has become less decommodifying and more marketised over time, whereas or less active and more passive in terms of managing land markets, if you will. Whereas in some of the more resilient countries, France and Austria, the approach has become less marketised and more decommodifying over time. So in the UK, for instance, in England, the Labour Party government that was elected after World War II, very radical government, and set up practically the entire British welfare state in the course of just 5 years, a really inspirational government in my view, adopted an equally radical approach to land management. And 1947 legislation allowed municipalities to compulsorily acquire land for residential development at existing use value. Now, it's important to mention that this legislation was rarely used in practice. They rarely went to court and compulsorily acquired land. Just the threat they could do it meant that landowners generally just sold. And this legislation enabled very high rates of social housing output in the 1950s in England, and also very high rates of building of so-called new towns that were built all around the UK, but particularly in England during the 1950s, and contained very high levels of social housing. And since the war, England has never managed to build as much social housing as it did during that period during the 1950s. And critically, that mechanism for accessing land resulted in very low land costs. So in Milton Keynes, for instance, which is the biggest of the new towns built under the post-war legislation in England, raw land costs were 1% of housing development costs, so it was just tiny. So that legislation, unsurprisingly, was very controversial. When the Conservative, the more right-wing party, returned to government, they rescinded it in stages, but in total from 1961. And from then, social housing landlords have had to pay market value for land. Since the 1990s, we've seen the advent of inclusionary zoning in England, and it's now very widely used to provide land and dwellings for social housing. But it pins social housing output to market output, and there is a long-term issue, certainly in my view, of just undersupply of all types of housing in England. So social housing is undersupplied because it's dependent on the market. Yeah. In the Netherlands, until the 1990s, municipalities also played a very radical role, interventionist role, in providing land for all types of housing. And almost all residential land was provided by municipalities, buying raw land, servicing the land, which is very expensive in the Netherlands. It needs drainage and flood defences, etc. Getting planning permission, parcelling up the land and selling the land for social housing and private housing. But critically, the private housing sales often cross-subsidise the social housing sales, and there were higher subsidies for providing social housing from central government, particularly on difficult to develop sites. So it was a big subsidy for social housing provision. That system weakened from the 90s very substantially. There's now much more market provision of land, and it's been partially replaced by inclusionary zoning, but I don't think it's a proper replacement. In France, by contrast, the French were very slow to provide social housing after World War II, very slow to intervene from land markets. That changed from the late 1950s, when we saw the establishment of urban priority zones. I won't inflict my French on you a second time, from 1969. And these allowed municipalities to purchase land via preemption, compulsory purchase or negotiation, and funded them to service the land. And since then, there's been a whole series of similar measures put in place. From the 1980s, the power over these was decentralised to local government, but so it's a bit more uneven across France than it was in the past, but it's still very radical intervention in land markets by the standards of other countries, and provides a lot of land for social housing. In Austria, similarly, government was slow to get involved in land market regulation, but in recent years, housing associations are legally required to reinvest their surpluses in land acquisition, as I mentioned, and municipalities have become much more activist in managing land supply in recent decades. So they can sell, or increasingly common, they lease land for social housing. They've set up, several landlords have set up public land bankers to do this, and the most famous example is Wohnfonds Vienne, the Vienna land banker. And also in recent years, some municipalities have provided zoning, special zoning for social housing. So you'll notice in the table, the kind of two exceptions in the analysis are Ireland and Denmark. So in both countries, we haven't seen changes in land for social housing. In Ireland, it's always been procured primarily on the market. For many decades, that wasn't a big barrier to supply because the economy was very depressed. There was no post-war economic boom, no post-war baby boom in Ireland, so land prices were low. But as the economy improved, land prices started to boom and it became very difficult to procure land for social housing. In Denmark, by contrast, there's no specific measures to procure land in a decommodified way for social housing, but there are controls on the purchase price housing associations can pay to keep prices down, and there's also a very long-standing land value tax introduced just after World War I, just before World War I actually, and which discourages land hoarding and prompts more efficient organisation of residential land. So finally, I want to discuss the final characteristic of social housing, the micro-political economy of social housing systems that influences their resilience and fragility, and that's the organisations that deliver it, the social landlords. So social landlords' organisational independence from government is generally associated with more resilient social housing sectors, organisational independence and also financial independence. Just 2 minutes. So you'll know that's not an original argument. Students of housing systems will know that's the classic argument put forward by Jim Kemeny. But my analysis of the 6 case study countries adds an additional consideration to this argument. And in my view, the social housing sectors that are most resilient are not just that are characterised by greater levels of organisational and financial independence from government, so non-government provision through, housing associations, cooperatives, arm's length bodies, but higher levels of government control of their social purpose and mission. So, for instance, the resilience of the social housing sector in Austria has been supported by their Limited Profit Housing Act that regulates the sector and requires them to confine their activities to providing social housing and protects their social mission. We see similar legislation in place in France that's been very useful in protecting the sector against the efforts of big international investors like Vonovia, I'll name them, to try access subsidies for their own profit-making housing. Conversely, in recent years, although most social housing in England has been provided by housing associations that are organisationally and largely financially independent from government, the social purpose of this legislation isn't underpinned by legislation. And in recent years, we've seen a decline in the proportion of output from housing associations, the big housing associations that's actually social housing. Quite a substantial amount of their output is now market housing for sale or for rent, or what's called affordable housing for rent, 80% of market rent, which is a lot of money in the likes of London. So social housing has fallen down the list of priorities. That's in large part pushed by government efforts to get the sector to fund itself, cross-subsidised social housing from market sources. But it also, in my view, also reflects a changing ethos of these organisations. So they're social businesses, but the business side is given a lot more emphasis now than the social side. So just to close, I don't debate that the long-term trajectories of social housing systems in terms of the proportion of households they accommodate are shaped by the macro political context in which they operate. That's obviously fundamental. But I've tried to make the point in the presentations that social housing systems also have an internal economy, internal politics, internal social profile, and this ecosystem or micro-political economy, if you will, also influences their fragility and resilience. In the paper, I've looked at the implications of this idea of micro-political economy for the key themes in the research literature on social housing. But I hope in your debates You can draw on some of the ideas presented here to inform your ideas about the designs of policies and also campaigns to protect and expand social rented housing systems. And in Ireland for the last 2 years, I've sat on a government commission on the future of housing, and I've chaired the bit on social housing. And I drew on some of the ideas in the analysis in terms of the policy proposals we put forward. So we emphasised, for instance, the need to diversify sources of finance into the sector in order to protect us from fluctuations in the availability of government finance. We emphasised the need to transition from our unsustainable rent model to a rent model based on rents linked to cost plus subsidies. And we also emphasised in our recommendations the centrality of land to providing social housing and the centrality of moving the provision of land away from dependence on the market and moving to try manage land markets and the supply of land for critical services, including social housing. Thank you for listening.
Okay. Thank you very much, Michelle, for explaining the systems and the macro and the micro political economy that matters for resilience and fragility. I learned a lot, and I think you demonstrate here that good analysis, good research is relevant for politics. I really like the way you analyze the system and you use it in your advisory role, and I can understand that you make impact with really analyzing how things works and how macro, micro political economies matter. I have many questions, but I'm sure the audience has as well. So please, audience, the floor is open. Who has a question for Michelle? Adriana.
Thank you very much for very interesting, very inspiring presentation. So I have a very small question, but I actually wanted to add something on the explanation of the French social housing system. And actually my question was, how do you deal or do you integrate recent transformations in those systems? And I will try to explain because, of course, I find in this classification very, the way we understand the system since a long time. However, especially in France, and this is why I mention it, researchers and the social housing sector is really very worried in the last years, especially since 2018, about the recent evolutions, especially in the last presidency, that actually fragilize a lot the system that you presented. And it's very robust, decommodifying over time based on these saving schemes of the entire population. 18% of the stock, 60% of the people eligible for housing. However, since 2018 and also very recently, there have been some changes, especially, and I'm talking because we are finishing a research project on privatization of social housing. And actually this privatization has been existing since a long time, but what really made it more intense was that the state decided in 2018 to save money from housing indirectly, because the most spending comes from housing allowances, increasingly since end of 70s. And they imposed landlords to lower the rents, and in the same time they lowered the housing allowances. So this does not affect tenants, but this affects landlords a lot, in there. And this, they meant to activate tenants, to make them more market, use market logics, diversify their production, also include affordable housing, land, market price housing, and so on. So they started to sell in order, as you said, to have more own equity. And we observed where they sold. How does it work? Because in the discourse, selling one house, one home can allow to build three. Prices should be close to the market, and they sell mostly to households, not to, or between landlords, not to private investors. And actually what we saw was that where they sold were where it was interesting to sell, so where markets are hot, where social housing is needed, and where it's impossible to build. When you sell one, it's impossible to build because there is no land, and the land prices are extremely high. So yeah, I mean the image is bleak, but just to make it a little bit less so. What is developing now in, what public authorities, local public authorities, such as Lyon, for example, which are very active in defending social housing, are what they are defending is to use the model of the community land trust, translated in France, to selling social housing. So sell only the house, not the land, and keep it affordable forever. So they imposed that inside the city of Lyon, where the market is the hottest, sales can be done only using this model. So this is about adaptation to a very hostile national context in transforming social housing to somehow affordable housing.
Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, the question was, how do you take into account such recent, I know it's very difficult, how do you take into account these recent evolutions that actually contradict long-standing evolutions that characterize social housing systems?
Yeah, well, it's difficult because my focus was on the long-term trends. So I am aware of the issues that have developed in France since the election of the Macron, I'll name him, governments. But I suppose the impact of them isn't yet evident in the long-term trend in terms of the size of the social housing sector. Now, it may be over time. And I should mention, governments have moved in quite a few of the countries. I didn't have time to go into all the details of everywhere, but the Austrian government moved to cut rents similarly. And so it's quite a popular policy for right-wing governments. The impact of that is often not felt until the medium term, whereas the impact of privatisation impacts much more significantly. So privatisation is simply a disaster because often it's just impossible to replace the housing. You can't provide housing. You can't provide housing on the same scale. So I understand the issues in France are very significant from the point of view of the French, which I think is enormously valuable culture of social housing provision and land markets. But still, the levels of privatisation are way, way below. For instance, in Ireland, 2/3 of the social housing ever built by local authorities has been privatised. If it hadn't been privatised, our social housing sector would be the same size as Austria. So comparatively, in 5 countries, it's not as significant, but it could be. I was interested in your point on land leasing because that strategy is now being used much more widely across Europe by governments to retain long-term control of the land. So some countries like Finland have a very long tradition of leasing. Most of Helsinki is built on leased land, but it's now increasingly common in France, in Austria, where municipalities use this to keep long-term control of the land for social housing, to keep control of what social landlords do, but also new forms of affordable housing tenures are developing, like we heard about in Spain yesterday, where they control the land use, but you can send the dwelling, but just at affordable levels. So I think that area of land leasing has a lot of potential, and that's something we actually put in our Housing Commission report also for Ireland, land leasing.
And next book, probably.
And next book.
Eleanor, you have a question.
Michelle, thank you. That was absolutely fascinating. I actually have 4 questions, but I'm not going to ask them now. There are other schemes. I really had to follow up, though, on the point that you were just sort of like making about privatisation and in France seeing it as a relatively short-term process, and making the comparison that you've made in Ireland and in the UK, and in England with Right to Buy, which actually is an incredibly long-term policy. It was a Labour policy from sort of like very early on, wasn't it? From sort of like, early sort of 50s and 60s, this right to acquire the home that you had. And it's almost like how fast you set the tap on to sort of like allow it to happen, and quite how it has decimated. In the last 20 years, we have lost 2 million social homes. Half of those have gone into sort of like, you know, private rental. It's you know, they're not for households who are living there. But it's the sort of wider destructive consequences of some of those, and some of the short, rapid effects that are being taken to try and affect that, or trying to sort of like reduce the impact of, you know, this loss, this sort of like seepage through privatisation. So particularly I'm thinking about local authorities setting up their own development companies, which sounds really, really positive, to try and have a loophole to have exception from being forced to sell their homes. And it's failed. I think of Haringey, I think of sort of like Croydon, I think of all of these examples where, you know, local authorities are being pushed into sort of like incredible situations. So my question, Rochelle, to you, and it is a question sort of like this, is how do you see where there might be some policy about seepage in whatever sort of like form, which in Ireland and in England has been there for very long, but actually has been the government turning the tap on and off, against what is beginning to happen, sort of like with France? And how do we make the case for, you know, the French government the French state not to turn the tap on?
Well, I suppose the issue is you're passing the bill to future generations, because you're eliminating housing that is there to address the needs of people in need of housing now. And those needs won't disappear. They're likely to grow as a social stock declines. So future generations will have to meet those bills. So it's just as Michael Harlow suggested. But I actually feel, this is my particular Irish perspective, it's actually very hard to make that case, because we've had what you call right to buy in the UK, we call tenant purchase in Ireland since 1936, right? And it's supported by all political parties. So I have been at a parliamentary committee giving evidence, and the civil servants were teasing me afterwards, saying I should get some kind of an award for being criticised both by a Trotskyist party we have called People Before Profit, and our right-wing government party at the same time, for suggesting getting rid of right to buy. And I was accused of undermining the rights of working class people to own their homes, which no one mentions the rights of people who are living in homeless accommodation. So in our case, I came to the conclusion through the Housing Commission that a social housing act modelled on the Austrian Act was particularly crucial. And we had trade unions on the commission, so we phrased it to ensure the support of the trade unions. So it was, we had a recommendation there would be a social housing act that would protect the long-term social purpose of social housing and guard against privatisation. Because I think one of the issues we've had is none of this has been underpinned by legislation. Individual ministers come in, they introduce, you know, a circular. The civil servants have fought very hard to roll it back, and they've introduced exemptions. And the ministers have just issued another circular overturning it. A recent, particularly offensive example is the civil servants required everyone buying their social house to use a mortgage. Okay, this is significant because they had huge amounts of sales by elderly people, to elderly people who miraculously had enough cash to buy the house outright. Because obviously it was their children, who were going to benefit. The minister rolled it back and allowed older people in sheltered accommodation to buy their house. So you have an issue where an elderly lady buys her home, she dies, her grandson inherits it and moves in and has, 19-year-old type behaviour in this sheltered housing. So in my view, sir, I think it's very hard to make the political case to politicians of all spectrums, because it's so attractive. It's a vote-buying mechanism, to be very blunt, in my view. So that was the suggestion we had.
Okay, great. Thank you. The coffee is waiting, but we have also 2 more urgent questions here in the back of the room. Karim, can you keep it short, please?
I'm going to be very brief. Thank you, Michelle, for a very informative and comprehensive presentation. So my question it's about the quantitative aspects of your analysis of the case studies in particular. I wanted to know whether you looked at the number of units, the size of the social housing in those particular countries in terms of numbers, vis-a-vis their impact on whether they decline or they stagnate or they increase. Because some countries it's in the millions, in others maybe hundreds of thousands. So it's quite significant amount of investment, maybe in the UK versus in Ireland or you know. So whether you had time to look at this, yes, no, or any further?
Yes, no, I just presented the figures on proportions of households, which are actually very difficult to pull together historically. I had to use a pile of sources, so there's bound to be errors. But I did look at output from the 1980s and also sales. And I didn't have issues on data on demolitions in every country. But in the Netherlands, I'll have to ask Maria this reason why. There's been very high rates of demolition of social housing. So that's one of the reasons why the sector shrank. So behind this are obviously multiple complex factors. And thanks to Dara Turnbull from Housing Europe, I should mention, who helped me put together the data, the background data from Housing Europe members. So.
Okay, thank you, Michelle. I'm inclined to answer your question on demolition. I will do it in the coffee break because now Leandro asked me to keep an eye on the break. But we have a last question from Goiko.
Okay, thank you for your inspiring lecture. My question is related to the issue of indirect finance, that finance which are not visible for the social sector. In fact, in period of construction, in terms, do we have different policies of government who are, let's say, reducing VAT for the construction of social sector? And is one side, and the other side is that micro political level. We are going to analyze three case studies in three capitals in post-socialist cities, and we are going to see which type of policy they are implementing in case they are making construction of social and sectors in terms related to the issue of paying local fees, whether they have a reduced fees in case when they are constructing social rental housing. And now, just curiosity, I'm coming from Croatia. When we entered the EU, then it was case that we had to introduce VAT for the construction land. In fact, we are paying 25%. If we are paying VAT of 25% of on building materials and services, and definitely from that point of view, social housing is not sustainable as such.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very good question. I didn't have time to go into it in my presentation, but particularly in resilient countries, there are a lot of invisible, non-financed financial supports for social housing. So you actually see in the right and the bottom of the graph, in France in particular, there's reduced VAT for social housing, reduced business and land taxes. In most countries, it's provided by charities, so they're not subject to income tax, which is a big subsidy. The French also have an employer tax. Also in the Netherlands, there is a guarantee fund. Government guarantees of debt are very widely used. Sometimes a very strong regulator acts as an effective guarantee of debt, and that reduces the interest costs. So I looked at the kind of main issues, but in many countries there are very complex invisible systems backing this up. On the issue of VAT, I've raised this with the Irish government many times because we also have VAT on social housing, which is 100% state finance. So the government is charging itself VAT to repay itself VAT. It's just crazy. And I get the same story that the EU are insisting on this, even though, as I keep pointing out, the French don't have VAT on social housing and they're already an EU country. So one issue, we were discussing this over coffee, I've realised from my interaction with civil servants is often national governments hide behind the EU and claim the EU is insisting. But if you actually raise this with the EU officials, they say, no one has come to us to ask.
Of course not.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So thank you very much, Michelle. We heard the times political will and money so many times. And I think you gave a very good explanation of how these systems work on the micro level. I see many more question marks on the faces. I suggest we continue the questions and discussions during the coffee break. And I myself, I'm really keen to say, well, I think the Dutch model is not fragile, but resilient. But we do that in the coffee break as well.